Welcome to Adoptee Cuento Cuento, a place for Filipino adoptees where we can have a voice and tell our stories, but also as well explore the different realms in the adoption process. Today we're talking about different struggles that adoptees face throughout this entire process from when they're a child to as they're growing up. As an adoptee, when you're having a bad day, usually what are we thinking about? What are we struggling with? How are we working through that? And as prospective adoptee parents or current adoptive parents, what are your adoptees, what are your children going through? What are they struggling with? And perhaps this episode will help you to connect and to be able to talk about those issues with your child. Couple things to talk about problems that adoptees face. One is adoption is very different for different folks. Some adoptees may have a lot of questions, a lot of feelings up front. Some, it takes them a while to process through those things. And sometimes they even come up in different phases of their life. So not all adoptee experiences are the same. But we do have some common struggles. As children, some adoptees are very aware of their own adoption. Either they've been told by their parent or they've known at a very young age. But even though a child has an understanding of the word adoption, they are told of their adoption, it still could be a very confusing place for children. In our last episode, Amy was interviewing her mother and talking about adoption since she knew from such an early age. But although she was told of her adoption, there was not as much conversation after that. And her mother had an understanding of, you are my child and I don't want to make you uncomfortable. And so we won't talk about it as much. But if you have any questions, obviously you can come to me and we could talk about it. But I think in the episode, Amy made a really good point on how children may not have an understanding of how to talk about that at such an early age, as they grow up, to talk about that with their parents. See this episode.
Unless you approach us, I don't know what to say, because I don't want to open it up always to you that you are adopted. I want you to feel that you are my child. So
That's
I would not all
That's hard having that though, between if a kid is, because I don't think kids, I didn't have that language growing up. I didn't understand what was wrong with me.
Every adoptees are like that.
Maybe, but I'm just saying, as children, I think as kids, it's hard for kids to go up to their parents and say, I'm having this issue, because we don't have language for it as children. Being 10 years old.
That is why you maintain it in your mind, and that's why what happened, and then you are so burdened and you don't know what to do.
Yeah.
As you could see, children aren't born with an understanding of how to talk about it. And a lot of times, even though it may be shared about adoption, if it's not talked about at least periodically with children, there is left for only conclusions that might be just very confusing for the adoptee. We're left to try to figure it out on our own. And often we're not given resources, throughout our childhood to understand what this really means. Maybe we understand that we came from maybe a different mother, a different set of parents, but then after that, there might not be an explanation of why we were given up or what this really means. And I think this is something that stays with us as we grow older, and until we have an understanding that we need to connect to other resources, we're kind of left in this confusion state, and it leads to us feeling very much alone. And another video, Amy shares about this alone feeling, and it's a very common thread throughout a different Akosi series that our adoptees have felt this being alone and if others are out there feeling the same. Another instance is when talking with one of our other adoptees, Maria, there was just so much that was left unsaid and not talked about. And it just created more questions for adoptees. And we might not even come and talk about it with family or friends, but we're left to kind of ponder that in our brains. And
My dad, even after finding out that my aunt told me, never brought it up with me or talked about it. Didn't talk to me about, like, how are you feeling now that you know? Did you know? This is what happened, how I got you. Like, I was so scared
So you
after
were
I
just
found out.
left alone to just wonder, ponder,
in our
no
brains.
guidance, and it doesn't always have explanations that we quite understand. And it's one of those elephants in the room. It's so much that we think about, or it comes up from time to time that we have questions about, but because maybe the parents aren't talking about it, we don't feel comfortable to talk about it as well. And we're left to have a big void that we should be talking about and asking questions about. And maybe when we're not feeling so great about adoption or some element, we could be having these conversations with our parents to get that confirmation, or perhaps if we're needing some extra affection or love, maybe we're not able to put that language to say, I'm feeling sad today about being given up, or I'm sad today to understand this is something that happens. Families divorce, or families may have to have other mothers, fathers, and siblings, and there's things that happen. But when we're not talking about those things, a lot of it we just internalize and left up to maybe not the greatest conclusions. In the Philippines, there is a rule, I believe, that you're supposed to find out at the age of 5, and some folks are learning between the ages of 5 and 9, and it's a very young age to kind of understand this. But then sometimes we're able to even look at our documentation, and a lot of that information kind of goes way above our heads, and it's a lot of emotions that's come together. There's a lot of physical emotions that we're holding on the inside, and at that young age, not be able to process those and get those out and talk about it, it kind of just is left up to be inside. One prevalent issue in inter-country adoption, or even interracial adoption, is when we have adoptees. Lots of adoptees from the Philippines were adopted by Caucasian parents, and oftentimes you're surrounded by a Caucasian community, and some of us who didn't have Filipino influences or other Asian influences in the community were often, the only Asian, and we don't see others that look like us. And one of the things that we're always seeking is, how do we kind of fit in that realm of, do I look like my birth mother? Do I look like other Filipinos? Do I look like other Asians? Or do we look very different? Do we act very different? In one of our episodes, Ashley, another adoptee, talked about growing up within a Caucasian community, a very Caucasian family, and she experienced racism herself.
So I grew up in a very, like I said, predominantly rural and predominantly white community. There was no one who looked like me. And because I had 2 younger brothers who were my parents' biological children, one, the oldest, John, looks like my dad's side, and Eric, the youngest, looks like my mom's side. And so I always didn't fit in and always kind of felt that way. And I also, growing up, experienced a lot of racism and hardship in that way, because again, it was a very predominantly white community.
As you could see, that race is very important to talk about, especially when we're in communities where we may be one of the very few non-Caucasians in the community. It's important to talk about, one, because again, it is the elephant in the room. We are very different, and although some folks may not see the difference in color, it's very apparent. Not seeing color doesn't mean that that's actually true. Many communities, many folks, when you go out into the community, they see the black hair, the brown hair, the tan skin. So folks do absolutely recognize the differences in races. And this is important to talk about, not only in terms of talking about heritage, learn about cultures outside of the US, but also as well just talking about how that will influence us as we grow into young teenagers and even into adults. Race is very important to talk about, especially with the violence that happens against non-Caucasians. Another important topic is, as Filipinos, when we get into spaces where there are other Filipinos, it comes to be that we've often felt that, right, we're not Filipino enough because we didn't grow up in the Philippines, or we didn't grow up learning Tagalog, or maybe a lot of that is stricken from us. We may not have an understanding of the history and different cultures and the food influences and different cultural norms. And so we don't grow up with that, and we're not feeling very Filipino when we get into that realm of space around other Filipinos. But then sometimes, actually a lot of times, we have Filipino Americans who are not feeling very American enough, right? We're not Caucasian, or we have the feeling of being othered because we are different. We have similarities, right, in the communities that we grow up. But again, there's still a difference that we can see and we can respect.
Those who have been involved or around other Filipinos who are non-adoptees as well, and then of course in the greater community as well, do you sometimes feel isolated between both, where, like, for as an example, when I go into one group, it's like, oh, you're obviously foreign, you're this and da 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 da. But then when they go into the Filipino communities, they start speaking in some, like, in one of the Filipino languages, and then it is a joke, which I totally like, just like roll off my back, but it gets to you after a while, where it's like, what kind of Filipino are you? You don't know this and this and this and this. So I was kind of curious with everyone else, if you've ever had that experience where it's like that isolation, where you're not Filipino enough to be Filipino, but you're also not this. So it becomes kind of like this weird orphaning, is the way my friend put it once. So I was just kind of curious.
No, yeah, I could definitely relate to that one. Maybe I do have more negative, because I don't know if that's just who I am, or if it is as a result of this kind of isolation that if you've experienced it too, I have.
I think one important element, and it depends on where you grow up, how adoption is looked at. In certain communities, orphans and adoptees might be a derogatory terminology, or it's considered very different. And if adoption is not talked about, or maybe even shared about in certain communities, children might not understand, and they'll use that in a way that isn't positive. So I know that there's been some YouTube videos of kids teasing other kids of, oh, you are just an adoptee, or you were adopted, you were left at birth, or in the Philippines, oh, you're ampon. And some of these could be jokes, but a lot of times when you see the reactions of the children that were told this, you see the truest nature, the truest feelings of what that feels like when you're told, you know what, you were given up and relinquished, and you were adopted, and these are not your real parents. And you could see the emotional toll that takes, whether it was just a joke for 10 minutes or it was a joke for like an hour. You see how much grief and trauma that the child experiences in literally 1 minute. You could see it immediately. So a part of this in different cultures is to take the shame out of being an adoptee, being an ampon, being an orphan, and that those don't mean anything negative. And while it could be a joke, it often shouldn't be a joke. One thing that's not often spoken about is children who have been paired with families and there hasn't been post-adoption services that have checkups with families, and some adoptees are left in domestic violence cases throughout their lives. And this has been prevalent. A lot of medical issues have surfaced, not only just in terms of regular needs for therapy and to talk about this, but with domestic violence cases, often the adoptee is just left on their own. This is an issue that isn't quite talked about, but abused children, whether it's in an adoption form or just in regular families, this is something, right? We don't want to have any abused children. We want to have loving, healthy families. But this is something that does happen in our community of adoption. And what resources are out there for adoptees, and how do they even get access to those resources or people that can help? Those are for children that know their adoption. Early on, they were aware of it, they were told their adoption, but there's a lot of folks that were not told until much later. I myself is a late discovery adoptee, but there's been plenty of adoptees who've been told much later, or they were even never told and somehow discovered their own adoption through other means. And I think eventually maybe there's an understanding where parents might not want to tell their children, but a part of this also is when you start the foundation of lies. I think that's where adoptees have a really big struggle with. Not necessarily that because we didn't tell you for a little while until you were ready. That's something that I believe that adoptees over time have come to accept, but it's really the foundation of different lies that we're told in order to build a story. Whereas telling us at an early stage, informing us of adoption, what that means, and allowing us to have access to a part of our truth in our early life absolutely would be much better than not ever telling us. It's our truths to own, and if that's something that isn't supported by all families, it's something that should be supported through during the adoption process, is allowing for adoptees to have a part of their truths. In the Filipino community, we have a lot of reservations around mental health. And this has been talked about on a lot of different podcasts about not having enough therapy help in our communities. And this is definitely true for adoption. I've been searching for a Filipino adoption therapist in the US for quite a while, and I haven't found one. I have found a lot of trauma-informed or family resources in terms of therapists, but none that really specifically talk to adoption. I think this is very specific. I know in other communities, in Korean communities, and I believe in Spanish communities, there's starting to be a movement of getting therapy resources that really are specific to adoption. But at this time, still searching for those resources, and there isn't a lot. And I think this is something that adoptees need to have, is to be able to identify and pull out those resources that can help us to process not only the emotions, the feelings, but how do we also have those tough conversations with family members, whether that's the adoptive parents, the birth families, but also how do we talk about this with our own families, with our own kids? And I think it's a lot to say when you're an adoptee and you are constantly learning about your life through the lens of other people. I knew a lot of people knew about my adoption way before I did. And I think that part, being able to process that with someone, it could be definitely hurtful within us. And being able to have someone to help kind of connect with our emotions and help us process through those, it's very important, because without being able to tap into that, it manifests in so many different ways if they're not dealt with. So I think that therapy resources and way to process and deal with, and also helping to restructure how we feel about families. A lot of things go into that, distrust, or having to understand what relinquishment means, whether that was forced or if it was voluntary relinquishment. A lot of that needs to be talked about with adoptees and their families, not just the adoptee. A lot could be said for parents who may struggle with seeing their child, adoptees struggle. I think it's absolutely important for both sides. One huge part that I've heard with adoptees is being able to find and do a search and reunion on with their biological family really is tough. They may not have the right information. A lot of times birth certificates are falsified. And you could see in our video with Maria, she talks about how all her birth records were falsified.
So I was 27 years old, the mother of two. And I'm like, yeah, Dad, can I have these documents? Because I need to apply for a passport. And he's like, yeah, sure, pick it up. It was the first time I ever saw the passport
Wow.
that I had from the Philippines. It was the first time I'd ever seen my birth certificate. And remember, my mom was 26 years old, turning 27 when she had me. And I wouldn't see her name until I was 27 years old. And that name would actually be false. That name would actually be not even her. Her name and her last name in the paper was right, but the middle name was wrong.
And why is this important? Why is correct information important for adoptees? One is, right, with Maria in her episode, she was talking about she was just trying to get a birth certificate to apply for a passport, something as simple as that, and not getting that correct information and having to take a while to be able to fix those issues. That's just for normal daily life that she was having to search through. But a lot of times, just being able to kind of comb through the weeds of the different stories, whether you find out this is not true, but this is, or this is a faction of it, a lot of that is really tough. And I know that there's some organizations out there that are trying to improve upon that at least adoptees get to have a little bit of a better narrative around their origins. That is something that a lot of us don't have access to yet. So correcting false narratives, falsified records is really huge. Another huge issue that adoptees struggle with is medical records. As we have children, as we grow older and we're seeing that maybe we're having symptoms of cancer or other things, right? It's important to have medical records. And it's so important that when we go to the doctor's office, the very first thing is, right, you look down the list of questions that you have to answer when you go to the doctors, and it says, what is your family's medical history? Well, I don't know. And I can tell you everything about the family, my adoptive family, but genetically, right, if my adoptive father was having some maybe heart palpitations or had cancer, that doesn't necessarily translate to me. And we may have things that definitely should be, answered or given to us so that we have an understanding to take care of our offspring, take care of our families as well. Medical records are very important. And to not have medical records and actual birth documents can be very detrimental. Lastly, one of the biggest things that I hear about from adoptees is how much are we able to really share our true thoughts, our true feelings, and how much can we really talk about our struggles to our loved ones, whether it's our adoptive families, parents, siblings, friends, families, or spouses. How much do we really feel comfortable to talk about that, especially our adoptive parents, right? As kids, as teenagers, and even as adults when we're trying to get answers. And surprisingly, or at least not surprisingly for me, but it was very low. There are some adoptive parents and families who are very open-minded, and from the get-go, they share about adoption. They start to talk about it at an age where they start to understand these things. But there are a whole lot more of other adoptees who are kind of left in the dark, and not really able to talk about. It's just something that we push underneath the rug and we don't talk about because of many reasons. And that leads to a lot of frustration, and it leads to feeling like just very shameful that, right, even if I have questions, even if I've had a great relationship with my family and a great upbringing, I still struggle, right? I still struggle with not being wanted or being relinquished, or I'm struggling with not feeling like I fit in certain areas, or I'd like to talk about race. I want to identify more with my Asian culture. I'm kind of a little upset that I don't have my language, or I don't know where this nose comes from. I think those things, a lot of it was like less than 40% that most adoptees don't feel comfortable in sharing and talking about with the very loved ones who are providing, right, this new life, that but not understanding what adoption is. So I think this is a big thing in our community, is just being able to talk about it, being able to be open and share about it. There's a lot of hesitancy, and I think on both sides, not just the adoptee, but I think also from the adoptive parent, they're very hesitant to talk about that as well for their various reasons. So these are just the snippets of what adoptees struggle with. Um, we could do a part 2 and a part 3. These just kind of hit the surface. Feel free to watch the different Akosi series episodes. Watch some of the adoptees all echo some of the same issues that you've heard throughout this video. This video is really to kind of highlight and touch very quickly on what adoptees face. As an adoptee, are you facing the same struggles? What struggles have you been going through and they haven't been mentioned? Comment below and let us know. I'm sure a lot of us have felt it, but even as adoptee families, what is your adoptee maybe struggling with? It could be a talking point, could be a discussion point for families, but a part of this is as families, regardless if this is your spouse that might be struggling or your child that might be struggling, how do we build and bridge families and communities to kind of work through these issues? And hopefully a lot of these videos will also cover how do we recover from these, how do we deal, and how do we heal from these. So thank you to our subscribers, our viewers, and our adoptees. Without you guys, we definitely wouldn't have come as far as we have with Adoptee Cuento Cuento, and we owe it all to you guys. So thank you so much. If you want to watch our last episode, Amy interviews her adoptive mother, and they talk about some pretty revealing things. And they learned a little bit on different sides of the adoption process. Please also click here to see any of our Akosi series where different adoptees are able to talk about their journeys and experiences. Until next time, paalam.